The cold wind cut through the streets like a blade, biting at Marcus's face as he pedaled his bike down the cracked sidewalk. His legs burned from the effort, muscles stiff and protesting with every turn of the pedals. The rain-soaked cardboard boxes strapped to his bike frame rattled with every bump in the road, a constant reminder of the miles he'd yet to travel. The sound of cars whizzing by filled the air, their engines roaring past him like predators in a hurry, unaware of the man, struggling in their wake. The streets, wet and slick from the rain, glistened under the dim glow of streetlights. But it was the smell that hit hardest, the sharp, acrid scent of exhaust fumes mixing with the damp cardboard and the stale air of forgotten neighborhoods. Marcus didn't mind the cold. What he minded was the way people looked at him. It was the way the world seemed to shrug him off, as if his existence didn't matter beyond the packages he delivered. As he approached his next stop, he could feel the tension building. He'd been riding all day, and the ache in his back had become a constant companion. He wasn't tired. He was weary of the small, quiet humiliations that marked his life. The looks of suspicion from customers, the curt dismissals, the muttered comments from strangers. And today he could feel it, the tension hanging in the air, thick like the clouds that threatened to burst open above him. He arrived at the destination, a well-maintained suburban home with a manicured lawn. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he pulled the package from the back of the bike, his hands freezing against the cardboard. He rang the doorbell, his heart beating a little faster than usual. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman who barely looked up at him. "Delivery for Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice steady but small against the cold wind. She stared at him for a moment, eyes scanning him as though assessing his worth. Then she pulled the door open wider, enough to accept the package. But before he could turn to leave, she spoke. "You know," she said with a sneer, "I didn't order from someone like you, but I guess even people like you need jobs, right?" The words stung, but Marcus was used to them. He had heard them too many times to count, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that cut into his soul. He forced a smile, nodding politely, but something inside him cracked. As he turned to leave, she called out after him, her voice laced with disdain. "Next time, don't get in my way." His bike creaked under his weight as he pedaled away, the harshness of her words ringing in his ears. The anger, the humiliation, the weight of it all seemed to press on him harder with every turn of the pedals. The streets felt lonelier now. The cold seemed colder, the rain heavier. He pushed harder, trying to outrun the feelings, but they clung to him like wet clothes. At the next corner, Marcus stopped for a moment. His legs trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sense of injustice. He had grown used to the isolation, to the way the world seemed to ignore him, but today it felt different. It felt like it was too much. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the grey sky, letting the rain fall on his face. He closed his eyes and prayed, as he often did when the world felt too heavy. "Please, Lord, I'm so tired. I need help." For a moment, there was silence. And then, something unexpected happened. A voice, gentle but firm, whispered in his ear, "You are not alone." Marcus froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He turned, expecting to see someone there, but the street was empty. There was no one around. The world around him seemed to pause for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background. "Who's there?" he whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no answer. The wind howled, and for a brief moment, everything felt still. The moment passed as quickly as it had. "Come," and Marcus shook his head, unsure of what had happened. He looked around, still not seeing anyone. The world seemed to return to normal, but the words echoed in his mind. "You are not alone." He shook off the unease and began to pedal again. But this time, something inside him felt a little different. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, there was something more than the weight of the world on his shoulders. As he rounded the next corner, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But it wasn't the same feeling of being scrutinized, of being an object in someone else's world. This was different. It was comforting, like a hand on his shoulder. He wasn't sure how long it would last. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. Marcus rode through the streets, his thoughts still tangled from the brief moment of peace. It was fleeting, and as the miles stretched on, the weight of his job pressed back down on him. The streets had become a blur of motion, people, cars, and buildings that seemed to watch him pass by with indifference. He had learned to ignore the stares, the whispers, the occasional muttered slur. But the bruises they left on his spirit, those were harder to shake. His next stop was a run-down apartment complex, the kind that was hidden away behind tall fences and overgrown weeds. He hated this part of his route. It wasn't the dilapidated buildings or the smell of trash that seemed to linger in the air. It was the people. They weren't rude, they were indifferent, dismissive in a way that felt like they were seeing him for the first time, and it was a reminder that the color of his skin made him invisible, but not in a way that protected him. Marcus parked his bike by the front steps, adjusting the straps on the box he carried. He wasn't sure what the package contained, but he had learned long ago that it didn't matter. To the people who lived here, he was a delivery man, an inconvenience at best, a target at worst. He braced himself for the familiar discomfort. He rang the buzzer at apartment 2C. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. He tried again, louder this time, his finger pressing the button with more urgency. After what felt like an eternity, the door buzzed open and Marcus stepped into the building. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single flickering light at the end of the corridor. The walls were cracked and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind a tired grey landscape. He shuffled up the stairs, careful not to trip on the uneven steps. When he reached apartment 2C, the door cracked open almost immediately, revealing a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in worn clothes. She looked him over, not bothering to hide her suspicion. She reached out to take the package without saying a word. Marcus could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she scrutinized him, making sure he wasn't a threat before taking the box. He'd seen it before. The way people looked at him like he was something to be feared, something to be distrusted because of the color of his skin. "Thanks," she said, her voice flat and disinterested. He nodded, about to turn and leave when she spoke again. Her words were quiet, but they carried with them the sharp sting of her judgment. "You're wasting your time, you know," she muttered. "All that energy for what? People like you. They don't belong here." The words were slow to sink in, but when they did, Marcus's chest tightened. He clenched his jaw, the bitter taste of shame rising in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was more hurt by her words or by the emptiness of the place she had called home, a place that had become a reflection of his own struggles, of his own sense of displacement. He turned to leave, but as he reached for the door, he felt something inside him snap. For the first time in what felt like the weight of the words, the stares, the hate, became too much to carry. He stopped. He needed to say something. "Why?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper, but it hung in the air like a challenge. "Why do you think people like me don't belong?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she closed the door, and the sound of the lock clicking into place sent a wave of finality through him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door, as if he could will an answer from behind it. But the answer, if it existed at all, wasn't in that apartment. It wasn't in the hate-filled words of strangers. It wasn't in the ways the world seemed to reject him. The air around him felt colder, the weight heavier, but then, as before, the quiet voice whispered to him again, "You are not alone." Marcus froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a second the world around him seemed to vanish. The noise of the street, the echo of the woman's words, the city itself, all of it was drowned out by that voice. This time, he didn't look around. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. You are not alone. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. And it made him realize something he hadn't allowed himself to consider, that maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of this world by himself. The realization felt like a small ember inside him, glowing, growing. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sliver of something else. Hope. As he got back on his bike, the weight of the package seemed lighter, the ache in his legs less intense. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he could make it, one pedal at a time. The day dragged on, each delivery blending into the next, the steady rhythm of the bike's pedals, the rain-soaked packages, and the distant hum of city life filling Marcus's ears. It was the same as lonely, tiring, and thankless. But the voice from earlier had stayed with him, like a quiet echo in the back of his mind, reminding him that he wasn't completely alone. He found himself thinking about the woman in apartment 2C, the one who had looked at him like he was a problem to be avoided. The sting of her words still lingered, but now there was something else too, a sense of defiance he hadn't felt in years. People like you don't belong here. The words tried to sink back into his skin, but this time he didn't let them. He couldn't afford to. He had learned long ago that the world would try to tear him down, to strip him of his dignity, but he had to hold on to whatever. Scraps of himself he could. As he approached the next stop, a sleek office building with shining glass windows, Marcus felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. This part of town was the hardest. It wasn't the wealth and the high-rise buildings, it was the feeling that he didn't belong here. The way people looked at him like he was invisible or worse, out of place. He locked his bike up near the building entrance, the cold air biting at his skin as he approached the front doors. Inside, the lobby was pristine, spotless. Marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the antiseptic tang of cleaning supplies. A young woman at the reception desk barely glanced up when Marcus walked in. "Package for Mr. Stevens," he said, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The receptionist didn't respond at first. She only glanced at him with mild disinterest before pointing to the elevators. "Third floor," she said, her tone flat. "Take it up." Marcus nodded, trying not to take the slight personally. He made his way to the elevator, his heart thudding in his chest. As the doors closed behind him, he felt the weight of the silence press in. He was used to it by now, the cold, dismissive indifference of people who saw him only as a delivery, nothing more. The elevator reached the third floor with a soft ding, and Marcus stepped out into a hallway lined with closed doors. He checked the address on the package and walked toward the door at the end of the hall. Before he could knock, the door swung open. A man in a sharp suit stood there, his eyes scanning Marcus with a brief flicker of recognition before turning away. "Yeah?" the man asked, not bothering to greet him. "Leave it on the table." Marcus hesitated for a moment. Something about the man's tone, the way he dismissed him without a second glance, made his blood boil. But he knew better than to argue. He placed the package on the nearby table, careful not to make any unnecessary noise. The man didn't even thank him. As Marcus turned to leave, the man's voice stopped him. "You know," he said, not looking up from his phone, "it's people like you who make things so difficult, so slow, so inefficient. If you tried, maybe you could make something of yourself." Marcus froze. The words felt like a slap to the face, cutting through the polite indifference with the sharpness of a blade. His fists clenched, the anger surging up from his gut like a tidal wave. But before he could say anything, the man waved him off. "Whatever, go," he muttered, as if Marcus was nothing more than a bothersome fly. The elevator ride back down was a blur of rage and humiliation, and when Marcus stepped out into the cold, his breath coming in sharp gasps, he felt the weight of the world was pressing down on him. It wasn't the insults, it wasn't the racial slurs and dismissals, it was the constant feeling of being unwanted, unseen, and unheard. He didn't even notice. The heavy rain falling as he began to pedal again, his legs aching, his heart heavy. The streets were a blur, the world spinning around him. But then, something in the distance caught his attention. A figure stood at the corner of the street, barely visible through the haze of rain. It was a man standing still, as if waiting for something. Marcus slowed, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure was dressed in a simple, weathered coat, his face obscured by the shadows. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he was imagining it, but as he drew closer he could feel it, the strange stillness that seemed to surround the man, the quiet that settled in the space between them. The man looked up as Marcus approached, and for a split second everything else fell away. The noise, the rain, the weight of the world, it all disappeared, leaving only this moment. This man, standing in the middle of the street as if he had been waiting for Marcus. For a brief second, their eyes met. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and strange, the man spoke. "You are not alone." The words hit Marcus like a bolt of lightning, the force of them making his chest tighten. He stopped in his tracks, unsure if he had heard correctly. The man smiled, a soft, kind smile, and his voice seemed to fill the air around them. "It's not over yet." Marcus blinked, his breath coming faster now, the rain falling harder. The figure began to fade, slipping into the mist like a memory. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a quiet hope stir inside him. Marcus couldn't shake the image of the man, the way he had stood in the rain, his voice cutting through the storm like a lighthouse in the dark. "It's not over yet." The words echoed in his mind, a flicker of light in the midst of his despair. But the next few hours felt like an eternity. The pain in his legs from the endless pedaling had intensified, and his mind seemed to race with 1,000 thoughts that all led nowhere. The rain came down harder now, each drop feeling like a reminder of how alone he was. By the time he arrived at his final stop, the world around him felt distant, as though he was watching it from the outside. The usual interactions, the indifferent stares, the cold shoulders, felt like a cruel echo of the same pattern that played out day after day. He arrived at an apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, a place that seemed even more run-down than the others. The neon lights from a nearby liquor store flickered as he locked his bike. There was a strange sense of heaviness in the air, like something was about to shift, but he couldn't quite place it. Marcus made his way up the steps to the 3rd floor, his legs sore, his heart weighed down by the constant barrage of microaggressions. He rang the buzzer for apartment 3A, his finger lingering on the button longer than usual. A muffled voice came through the speaker. "Yeah? What do you want?" "I have a delivery for Mr. Harris," Marcus said, trying to sound professional despite the exhaustion dragging at his words. The door buzzed open a moment later, and Marcus stepped inside. The hallway was dark, and the floors creaked beneath his feet as he moved toward the apartment. The air was thick with the smell of old food, mildew, and something else he couldn't quite place. When he knocked on the door, it opened immediately, revealing a man in his late 40s, wearing a worn-out t-shirt and pajama pants. He didn't smile, didn't thank Marcus. Instead, he glanced down at the package with a look of annoyance. "Leave it here," the man muttered, stepping aside. Marcus hesitated. His frustration, built up over the course of the day, started to bubble to the surface. The man's apathy, the dismissal, it all felt too much to bear, but he knew better than to say anything. He placed the package on the floor by the door and turned to leave. As he was about to step away, the man spoke again, this time with a sharp edge to his voice. "You know," he said, his eyes narrowing, "if you people stayed in your own neighborhoods, things wouldn't be so messed up. You ever think about that?" Marcus froze. His chest tightened, and his breath caught in his throat. The words stung like nothing he had heard before. The casual cruelty, the assumption that he was lesser, that people like him were the problem. It cut through him, deeper than anything he had endured today. His hands shook as he turned to face the man. The anger was building inside him, the urge to fight back, to scream, to make him understand how much this hurt, how much it hurt. But then something strange happened. In the middle of the storm of his emotions, he felt the familiar weight of a presence, calm, grounding, unwavering. "You are not alone." The words were a whisper in his mind, but they were enough. It wasn't a reminder. It was a strength. The flood of anger that had threatened to swallow him whole began to recede, replaced by a quiet certainty that he didn't have to carry this pain by himself. For the first time in what felt like, Marcus felt the urge to walk away without responding, to leave the hurt behind and not carry it any longer. Without saying a word, he turned and walked back down the hall, his feet heavy, but his heart lighter than it had been in hours. The moment he stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. The streets seemed quieter now, the world a little softer. He could still feel the sting of the man's words. But it didn't weigh him down the way it used to. Instead, it felt like something that had been given to him to carry for a while, something that would eventually fade. He climbed back onto his bike, the familiar creak of the pedals beneath him, and as he rode, he couldn't help but notice the world around him in a new light. The weight was still there, still part of his existence, but there was something else now, something brighter. He didn't know what the future held, or if the world would ever see him for who he truly was. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, enough to keep going. And as he turned a corner, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, despite himself. The weight on his shoulders, though not gone, was easier to carry now. The days blurred together, the repetitive grind of delivering packages, the ending cycle of exhaustion and brief encounters with people who hardly noticed him. Everything had become familiar, in a way that made it hard to remember a time before. The world had its way of wearing you down slowly and methodically, until all you had left was the rhythm of your work, the ache in your body, and the heaviness in your heart. Marcus was no stranger to this rhythm. It was his life, and it had been for as long as he could remember. But something had shifted in him after that moment on the street, the quiet, unspoken encounter that had left him with a faint but undeniable sense of peace. He wasn't sure what it meant, but the words kept echoing in his mind. You are not alone. Today was like any other. The sky was grey, and the rain fell in a steady stream, soaking the streets and the boxes strapped to his bike. The bike felt heavier today. His body was aching more than usual, the weariness from the past few days settling deep in his bones. But he kept going, the steady rhythm of his pedaling comforting in its predictability. The next stop was a gated community, the kind where people lived behind high walls and fancy security systems. The houses were pristine, manicured lawns, stretching as far as the eye could see, and everything about the place screamed wealth and privilege. It was the kind of place that made Marcus feel even more invisible. Here, no one looked at him, no one acknowledged him, and if they did, it was the kind of look that made him feel like an outsider, a reminder that he didn't belong. He locked his bike at the entrance, the rain pouring harder now, the sound of water slapping against the pavement filling his ears. As he made his way toward the house, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the unease that came with being here, the discomfort of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he gave, he would be the hired help, a shadow passing through the lives of people who would see him. He rang the doorbell, and a woman in her late 40s answered, her eyes cold and disinterested. She barely looked at him, her gaze flicking down to the package before she stepped aside to let him in. "I'll take it," she said curtly, reaching for the box. Marcus hesitated, something inside him refusing to let go of the quiet anger that had been bubbling up ever since the encounter with the man in apartment 3A. He handed her the package, his hand lingering a second too long, as though daring her to see him, to acknowledge him for once. She didn't. Without a word, she took the package, her expression unchanged, and shut the door in his face. The coldness of the door, closing behind him, echoed in his chest. The bitterness of the moment was sharp, but there was also something else, something heavier, deeper. The weight of being constantly overlooked, of living in a world where his humanity was measured by the service he provided, not by the person he was. Marcus stepped back, his mind swirling with a storm of emotions. He wanted to shout, to throw the anger he felt into the air, but it was pointless. It wouldn't change anything. This was the way the world worked, and he was another face in the crowd, another person who had to keep moving forward, even when it felt like everything was trying to hold him back. As he walked back to his bike, his mind replayed the encounter. The door had slammed shut, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more had been lost in that moment. A piece of himself, his dignity, his worth. And then, as he was about to mount his bike, he heard it again. That soft, quiet voice, the one that had followed him since, that night in the rain. "You are not alone." The words weren't loud. They didn't demand attention. They existed, hanging in the air like a thread of light in the darkness. For a moment, Marcus stopped. He closed his eyes and breathed, letting the words settle into him like a balm. The weight of the world, the hurt, the anger, it was still there, pressing against him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the world would ever truly see him, or if the weight of injustice would ever fully lift. But as he stood there in the pouring rain, he realized something. It didn't matter if the world saw him. It didn't matter if people acknowledged him. He was not alone. The thought settled deep within him, grounding him in a way he had felt before. The weight of it didn't disappear, but it didn't break him either. With a deep breath, Marcus mounted his bike again, the familiar creak of the pedals beneath, him steady and sure. The road ahead was long, but for the first time it didn't feel like something he had to face alone. The days continued their monotonous march, each one blending into the next like a series of disconnected images, a blur of long hours on the bike, aching muscles and endless deliveries. Marcus's body was becoming accustomed to the constant grind, but his mind was a different story. There were moments when he could still feel the sting of those casual slights, the sharp barbs of prejudice that punctuated his every interaction. The weight of them threatened to pull him down, but he kept pushing forward, one pedal at a time. It was another grey morning when the phone call came in, the familiar ringtone cutting through the silence of his apartment. He hadn't been expecting it, and the interruption startled him. He reached for the phone, checking the caller ID. It was from his boss. "Marcus," his boss said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "We've got a rush order for you today. Can you take care of it?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Sure, where's it going?" His boss rattled off an address across town, one he hadn't been to before. It was an unfamiliar part of the city, one of the wealthier neighborhoods, a place where the people seemed to move in a world apart from his own. But Marcus didn't think twice. It was another delivery, another job to do. He grabbed his bag and headed out, locking the door behind him. The sun hadn't quite risen, and the city was still, quiet, wrapped in the early morning fog. The cool air nipped at his skin, and as he rode through the streets he felt the familiar rhythm of his bike beneath him. But today, there was something different in the air, something heavier. He arrived at the address shortly after, a gated mansion surrounded by high walls and carefully manicured gardens. The contrast between this neighborhood and the one he had left was stark. Here, everything was pristine, gleaming in the early morning light. The houses were big, intimidating in their size and wealth, and the people who lived here seemed to take notice of the world beyond their gates. Marcus had seen this before, this sense of superiority, this belief that the world outside their walls didn't matter. He locked his bike by the gate, feeling the unease creep into his bones. He had been to neighborhoods like this before, but there was something about them that made him feel small, invisible. He made his way up the long driveway, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the expanse of the property. When he rang the doorbell, a moment passed before the door opened, and a man in a tailored suit appeared in the doorway. His eyes scanned Marcus, and for a brief second, Marcus saw the flicker of something, an assumption perhaps, before the man stepped aside. "Package?" the man asked, his tone sharp, dismissive. Marcus held up the package, offering a polite smile, but the man barely acknowledged him. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively, as if to hurry him along. "Leave it inside, the front door's unlocked," the man said without so much as a thank you, "and be quick about it." The words hit Marcus like a cold wind, and he struggled to keep his expression neutral. He had grown used to being treated as invisible, but it didn't make it any easier. He stepped inside, the interior of the house a sharp contrast to the coldness of the world outside. The floors were polished marble, the furniture sleek and modern. It was the kind of home that seemed to demand respect, though none was given in return. As Marcus made his way through the grand foyer, he could feel the eyes of the housekeeper, a woman standing near the kitchen, watching him as he passed. There was no acknowledgement, no smile, nothing to break the coldness of the atmosphere. He found the door to the study at the end of the hallway, the place where the package was supposed to go. He knocked once, softly, and when there was no answer, he pushed the door open. Inside, the man in the suit was seated behind a large desk, his back to the door as he looked over papers. The room was silent except for the sound of his pen scratching against the paper. "Leave it here," the man muttered, not looking up. Marcus placed the package on the desk, his fingers brushing against the edge of the wood. He could feel the weight of the man's dismissive attitude pressing down on him, as if he were nothing more than an interruption to whatever world the man inhabited. As he turned to leave, the man spoke again, his voice filled with a kind of casual cruelty. "You know, if you people worked harder, maybe you'd be able to afford a place like this, instead of running around delivering packages all day." The words hung in the air, sharp and biting. Marcus's heart clenched, his stomach tightening as the weight of the insult hit him full force. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like this, but it made it easier. The bitterness of the man's words lingered in his throat, choking him, making it harder to breathe. For a moment Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, the words ringing in his ears. The anger, the humiliation, the injustice of it all surged within him, threatening to spill over. But as he was about to say something, anything, a quiet voice cut through the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. "You are not alone." The words, gentle and firm, settled over him like a blanket, calming the storm inside. He stood there for a moment, letting the words wash over him. And then, with a deep breath, he walked out of the room without saying another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. As he stepped back outside, the rain had begun to fall once more, a soft, steady drizzle that soaked through his jacket and made the world feel even colder. But it didn't matter. The weight of the world was still there, pressing on him, but the voice, "You are not alone," echoed in his mind. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't feel quite so small. He climbed back onto his bike, the familiar creak of the pedals beneath him, and as he rode through the rain, he felt something shift. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a sudden change in the world around him, but it was enough to keep going. It's not over yet. The storm had been building for days, not in the sky, but inside Marcus as well. It was in the tightness of his chest, the way his legs ached after each delivery, the weariness that seeped into his bones at night. It was in the heaviness of the words he had heard, the casual racism that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was a storm that quite broke, that lingered beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to finally overflow. As he pedaled down the streets the next morning, his body still sore from yesterday's deliveries, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel it in the air thick with tension, heavy with the weight of the world pressing in on him. The rain had stopped for now, but the sky was still overcast, the clouds hanging low like a blanket, suffocating everything beneath it. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of city life muted by the grey haze. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marcus had grown accustomed to the quiet indifference of the people he delivered to. He knew how to ignore the stares, the muttered slights, the dismissals. But today it felt different. Today the world felt like it was closing in on him, like the weight of every hurt, every slight, every injustice was pressing down harder than it ever had before. He pulled up to his next stop, a small apartment building tucked away on a side street. The building was old, weathered, with cracks running down its brick walls. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the front door was chipped and peeling. It was a stark contrast to the shiny, perfect homes he had delivered to earlier in the week, but it was familiar. This was his world. This was the world of people like him, forgotten, left behind by the shiny, polished world outside. He parked his bike and made his way up the stairs, the creak of the wood beneath his feet echoing in the silence. The door to the apartment was open when he arrived, and a woman in her 50s stood in the doorway, a tired expression on her face. Her clothes were simple, worn, but there was a kindness in her eyes that made Marcus feel like he wasn't a delivery man. For a moment he didn't feel invisible. "Package for Miss Harper," he said, offering her the box with a small smile. She took it from him with a nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but genuine. There was no pretense, no dismissive air, Gratitude. Marcus nodded, about to turn and leave when something unexpected happened. The woman's eyes met his, and for a split second, he saw something in them, something that made the weight on his shoulders feel a little lighter. She looked at him not as a worker, not as a person who was there to serve her, but as a fellow human being. "You know," she said quietly, almost as if she was speaking to herself, "the world can be real hard on people like you." Marcus paused, his heart tightening. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had heard these words before, but from someone who seemed to truly understand. "You don't have to tell me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it doesn't matter. I have to keep going." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I know," she said, "you're strong. But even the strongest people need someone to lean on sometimes." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much of his life pretending that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't need help. But standing here in this small apartment with this woman who had given him nothing but kindness, he realized that maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his own. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. But as he stepped back into the hallway, the familiar sting of reality hit him. It wasn't enough. Hope alone wouldn't change the world. It wouldn't erase the years of hurt, of prejudice, of being treated as less than. It wouldn't make the world see him as a person, not a delivery man. And like that, the storm inside him surged again, the anger and frustration rising to the surface. He slammed the door behind him and walked down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He was tired of being overlooked, tired of being dismissed. But more than anything, he was tired of feeling powerless, of feeling like the world was a place that would see him for who he truly was. As he stepped outside, he didn't stop to check the weather. He didn't care whether it was raining or sunny. He started pedaling, the sound of his bike's tires against the pavement almost drowned out by the storm in his chest. And then, as the storm inside him was about to consume him, he heard it again. "You are not alone." The words were soft but firm, cutting through the anger and the despair like a beacon in the dark. They didn't make the pain go away, they didn't erase the injustice, but they did something else. They gave him the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep pushing through the storm. He rode through the streets, the rain beginning to fall again, and for the first time he didn't feel like the storm was something that could break him. He felt it like a challenge, something that he could face and survive, because he wasn't facing it alone. And, in the back of his mind, the quiet voice kept repeating, "You are not alone." The days that followed were a blur of deliveries, each one wearing Marcus down a little more. The cycle of riding through the city, feeling the sting of cold rain and the weight of boxes pressed against his back, had become a routine. The exhaustion was wearing at his body, and the sting of prejudice, while present, had started to dull. But something in him was changing. Something deep within him was starting to shift. The world outside remained indifferent, its heartless hum continuing as usual. The people who lived in the nicer neighborhoods, the ones who looked at him like he was nothing more than an object, continued with their lives, untouched by the reality he faced every day. The insults, the glares, the dismissals. He had grown numb to them, or so he thought. It was during one of his deliveries to a well-kept office building downtown that everything seemed to come to a head. The office was sleek, the kind of place that felt so polished it almost hurt to be in. The walls gleamed with expensive art, the floor was covered in rich carpets, and the air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and perfume. It was a world that felt so separate from Marcus's own. He stood at the front desk, waiting for someone to come and sign for the package, when the receptionist looked up from her phone. She barely glanced at him, giving him the briefest of nods before turning away to finish her conversation with someone else. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to shake off the feeling of being out of place. The silence between them stretched, and it was like being invisible in a room full of people. The receptionist's eyes flicked to him only once, but the brief moment of eye contact was enough to make him feel small, less than. After a moment, she finished her conversation and turned to him. Name? Marcus Thomas, he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice felt like it was coming from far away. She jotted down the name on her tablet, barely making eye contact again. Wait here, she said flatly, her tone dismissive, as if he were an inconvenience she had to endure. The seconds felt like minutes, the silence between them growing thicker with each passing moment. The receptionist's indifference was like a weight on his chest, and it brought all the old familiar feelings to the surface, the feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a faceless worker in a world that didn't care. Finally, someone came down from the office, a man in a sharp suit, his face a mask of polite professionalism. He barely looked at Marcus, his eyes scanning the package before he nodded, took it, and turned back without a word. "Thank you," Marcus said, but